All right, everybody, I'm Logan Alec, I'm a CPA, and today I want to talk to you about COVID-19 and more specifically the economic fallout resulting from COVID-19. If you saw my recent video, I'll put a link to this one in the description in case you haven't seen it. But if you have, then you know that the economy contracted significantly during the second quarter relative to the first quarter. At that time, the report said GDP was down 32.9% on an annualized basis. They eventually revised that figure, that estimate, to 31.7%. Now, just to clarify, this doesn't mean that GDP actually decreased by 31.7% in a quarter. It means that if the contraction kept going down the path it went during the second quarter, then we would end up with a decrease of 31.7% at the end of 1 year. So the reality isn't quite as bad as 31.7% might make it sound, but it's still a big drop, and it's clear that the economy has slowed down relative to where it was in January or February. And while unemployment has gotten better since what it was in April, it's still pretty bad. I know a lot of you are concerned about this. Maybe you've had your hours cut or you've been laid off, and we're all wondering when the economy will go back to normal, or the new normal at least. So this video is going to be all about how coronavirus could impact the economy throughout the rest of the year and even beyond. First, I want to cover 2 reasons the economy could continue to struggle, and then I'll go over 2 positive developments that could be signs of a quick recovery. First reason that the economy could continue to struggle is that schools are and have reopened, oftentimes without a plan in place. I published a video recently on the topic of reopening schools. You may have seen it. And yes, there are pros and cons to both sides, but the reality is that putting more kids in contact with each other without a solid plan is inevitably going to have an effect on cases. Yes, we can encourage them to socially distance. Yes, we can have them go on certain days, others on other days, things like that. But states or counties that opt for in-person education may have trouble minimizing cases. You may have seen some of the photos from schools that have already reopened. Sometimes kids are packed in, and sure, most kids who get COVID-19 will be fine. Younger people tend to have mild cases or even no symptoms at all. But that won't stop them from spreading it to other people who may be more vulnerable, such as older family members. We've already seen some schools reopen and then close back down again once the virus started to spread. Overall, there are good reasons to reopen schools. I'm not just completely against it at all, but in places that choose to reopen, it wouldn't be surprising to see more cases. And from there, it will be harder to sell the idea of coming back to work in person, and states could go through the same process we saw in Texas, for example, where they tried to reopen and they had trouble keeping the cases under control. So every time that we try to open back up without being fully prepared or having a good plan in place, there's a chance the virus will start to spread. We don't want another lockdown, but we have to be smart with things. There have been a lot of research ideas on this topic, and some studies seem to indicate that kids of all ages can spread the virus, and in fact that kids over 10 could spread it just as much as adults. So even though COVID-19 isn't usually as serious for children as it is for adults, we can't ignore the consequences of putting kids into classrooms together. Along with schools reopening, another really critical issue here is that our relief programs are starting to expire, or have expired, frankly, throughout the United States. If you're watching from another country, maybe things are different where you are, but here in the U.S., there hasn't been much for the people since the CARES Act was signed in late March. That bill included stimulus checks, $1,200 for most adults, $500 for dependents under the age of 17, but it's been about 5 months since the CARES Act was signed, and we haven't had any other significant relief. The CARES Act provided an extra $600 in weekly benefits for every American on unemployment, but again, that provision expired end of July. And the Trump unemployment memorandum, the Lost Wages Assistance Program that kind of raided a FEMA disaster relief fund, for $300 a week in most states, $400 a week in a few if the states kicked in the extra $100, that's dried up in most states as well. So these were the 2 main sources of financial relief for the majority of Americans. If you've been watching my stimulus content, you know that a second stimulus bill before the election looks like a long shot at this point. So rushed school reopenings and lack of stimulus are 2 reasons why the economy may not have as beautiful recovery as people like Larry Kudlow claim it will. But now let's talk about some positive developments that could indicate a quicker recovery. Number 1 is the vaccine. Of course, the big question about coronavirus is how long it will take to develop a vaccine, and a widely available vaccine would be the best thing right now with respect to both the economy and public health. During the RNC, Trump said that we will produce a vaccine before the end of the year, or maybe even sooner, and that's a little optimistic. You may have seen the news that Johnson & Johnson halted a vaccine trial. I don't think we can be sure about anything right now in terms of timing. There's a lot of conflicting information on the progress. It's hard to predict when a vaccine will be ready, and even at that point, it will take time to produce enough for everyone in the country, let alone the world, as well as to distribute it. Now, with that being said, I don't want to overstate things, but there are some vaccines in development that could eventually be approved for broader use. I recommend the New York Times Vaccine Tracker if you're interested in this topic. Right now, they're monitoring a total of 44 vaccines that are already being used in clinical trials on humans, along with 92 preclinical vaccines that are being investigated in animals. So if you aren't familiar with the testing process, I'm not a doctor, I don't want to make this a medical video, but essentially every new vaccine has to go through several stages before being used on a larger scale. Vaccines are first tested on animals, and based on those results, they can advance to phase 1. In phase 1, they test it on a small group to make sure it's safe, make sure it has potential. Then during phase 2 and 3, they can start testing it on more and more people. At that point, they'll be able to identify side effects, study results for different groups, things like that. And eventually, after phase 3, if the results were promising, the vaccine can be approved for limited or full release. This isn't something you hear about every day. A vaccine moving from phase 2 to phase 3 isn't exactly at the top of the news cycle right now, but every vaccine that advances to the next phase is another potential chance at immunization. Right now, the tracker says that there are technically a handful of vaccines with limited approval, but these were approved by the Russian and Chinese governments, and there are concerns that they are moving too quickly and ignoring potential safety issues. But even putting those aside, there are also over 10 vaccines in phase 3 trials from teams around the world, and a few of them could be approved in the future. Pfizer, for example, is working on a vaccine called BNT162b2, which they expect to submit for approval very soon, and if it's approved, they plan to produce up to 100 million doses by the end of 2020 and 1 billion by the end of 2021. Of course, this is all speculation right now. I can't say there's definitely going to be a vaccine by the end of the year like Trump says or anything like that, but there are some promising vaccines moving through the testing process, and an effective immunization would change the course of the pandemic relatively quickly. So I don't know for sure what's going to happen with a vaccine. I'm sure there are still a lot of regulatory hurdles to jump through, but even aside from that, the COVID-19 death count has been trending downwards. New cases have had an uptick recently, but the death count is down significantly from the previous highs and has steadied out. Now, like I said, cases have had a recent uptick. We are testing more, right? We'll have to see what happens throughout the colder months here. Now, there are concerning signs in some states as well as in Europe. I'm sure you've heard and read that in many European countries, new case counts are hitting new highs. I don't know what's going to happen after this video goes live, but suffice it to say that deaths have consistently decreased and have leveled out in some respects. Yes, it was slow progress, but it was still progress. Okay, everybody, thank you so much for watching to the end of the video. I'm sure there's a lot more that I could say, but right now I think these will be some of the most important factors in the fight against COVID-19 in terms of public health and in terms of the economy and the recession. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.